Hi guys, this is the last installment of our botany series, so you know I am super excited because as you know I hate plants. In this video we're going to cover plant growth, plant development, we're going to talk about plant movement, we're going to talk about plant signaling. Now it sounds like a lot, but believe it or not we're going to do all of that in like 21 slides, so let's get it going. Okay, so only certain regions of a plant actually grows. And those regions are called meristems, also referred to as meristematic tissue or meristematic sections. So meristems are the part of your plant that's actively growing. They're the part that contain your plant's stem cells, so the parts that are always going to be in an embryonic stage, constantly renewing and growing. Now, unlike humans or animals in general, plants are going to only regenerate new cells in certain areas. So we have what we call our apical shoot meristem. So if you look at the picture, let me get my laser, whoops. It's going to be this region right here. So at the very top, so apical, shoot system meaning above ground, this is the region of your plant that's constantly growing up. That's why if you cut the top of your plant off, it stops growing because you've removed these apical meristems or apical buds. When this part of your plant grows, your plant increases in length, so it's growing upwards. This is referred to as primary growth. So when a plant grows, or when a plant goes through primary growth, it lengthens, it gets taller, it gets longer. Another area that you are going to have an apical meristem will be in the roots. Every single root at the very tip will have its own apical bud or apical meristem, and those grow down. Again, this is going to be primary growth because we're still lengthening our plant. We're just lengthening in the opposite direction. Okay, so let's recap real quick. We grow up. When we get taller, we're doing so from our apical shoot meristem. But when we grow longer, like further down into the soil, we're doing so by our apical root meristem. Now, when plants increase their girth or their width, that is lateral growth, and that happens because of a lateral meristem. So like right here, for example, in the middle where that red section is. And this is called secondary growth. So secondary growth is all about getting wider, getting thicker, whereas primary growth is all about getting taller or longer. Now, plants don't produce flowers constantly. It really does depend on the time of the year, how warm it is, how long the days are. It depends on a bunch of other things that we'll talk about. And you also have to remember that we just think of flowers as, being something pretty to look at or something nice to smell or something that you give only on Valentine's Day. But for a plant, this is going to be the reproductive region of that plant. So plants that flower, like I said before in a previous video, are called angiosperms. And your flowers are their reproductive sections. So angiosperms have 4 floral organs: sepals, petals, stamen, and carpels. They're all found in the general vicinity of a quote-unquote flower. The actual reproductive organs are the stamen, which are the male parts, and the carpels, which are the female parts. The sepals and petals are there primarily for protection and for attraction, and they are sterile. So there's some pictures coming, I promise. Anyway, so a stamen consists of 2 sections, a long thin stalk called a filament, and on top of that filament sits a little tubular sac, for lack of a better term, called an anther. So the filament is the thing that holds the anther up. We want the anther held up because the anther is where pollen sacs that produce pollen are found. So you want that as high into the actual air as possible so that when insects or wind or whatever is going to be used to reproduce or to help this flower reproduce starts going, it can actively get at the pollen. Your carpel, which like I said is your female part of the flower, has 3 main sections of it. Though there is a long middle part called a style, and on top of the style sits a stigma. The stigma is sticky, and that's because that's where pollen grains are going to land and eventually grow down into the ovary part of the plant. So you need it to be tall so it sits out of the flower, meaning that pollen can easily get onto it. You want it to be sticky so that the pollen stays on it. Now at the very base of your carpel, or at the bottom part of the style, is the ovary. And the ovary contains ovules, which eventually will become seeds. Plants can have single carpels or a group of carpels that are all fused together called a pistil. All right, so let's go over the anatomy one more time. So this entire thing is your flower. And please note, this is what we call an idealized flower, meaning it's just a general representation. So the flower itself has a stalk, which is called the receptacle. It's the part that everything kind of sits on. And the little tiny green leaves are the sepals. They used to protect the flower bud before it opened up. Once the bud has opened up, your flower is going to develop petals. Your petals tend to be large. They tend to be brightly colored because they're trying to attract the attention of whatever your pollinators are, if they're insect or animal pollinated. These two parts are sterile. So your petal and your sepal are sterile. They don't help with the actual reproduction. They're there primarily for attractive purposes and protective purposes. Now let's look at this middle part. That's where all the action is. Let me change to my laser. The long, thin stalks that have these little bean-shaped things on them, this entire thing is your stamen. So this right here, would be one stamen. The top part is the anther, and then the stalk is the filament. Okay, so inside of that anther, that's where your pollen grains reside. Now, right in the middle of the flower is the female part. So this entire thing is called your carpel. Up here, this is the sticky region called the stigma. That's where your pollen grains are going to land. The stalk that it sits on top of is called the style, so it helps to hold it up so it's above the petals of the flower. And then where it widens off down at the base, that's the ovary. Inside of the ovary are the ovules, which would be the gametes of the female part of the flower. When a pollen grain lands, it's going to send down a pollen tube, and that pollen tube is going to connect with one of these ovules, and then there'll be a transferal of genetic material, which will then turn this ovule into a seed. This is the part of the plant that will later on become the fruit. Okay, so that was just a general little introduction to the reproductive parts. We'll talk about fruit and stuff in a little bit. Now, plants are capable of movement. They're just not capable of, packing up their luggage and, changing physical location. They can't go into your neighbor's yard because your neighbor waters his lawn more frequently than you do. But they can move. That ability is called tropism. And there are several types. So tropism is plant movement in response to, well, not necessarily just plant, but plant or organism movement in response to an external stimulus. So something is attracting or causing this plant to move. External stimuli can be things like light or heat or water or gravity or even touch. So plants can and will grow or move in the direction of a bunch of different things. So we're going to go through the main kinds of tropism. The first one is called phototropism. So from photosynthesis, you should know photo means light. So phototropism is growth or movement towards light. And you might have seen this if you have plants in your home. If you keep your plant in a shaded area, they will kind of grow around whatever's blocking the sun from, directly hitting them. So it's growth towards light. It is caused by an uneven distribution of a plant hormone called auxin. So pretty much the auxin builds up on the side that's darker, and that side grows faster than the side that's getting light, and it causes the plant to bend. So you don't necessarily need to know what auxin does. You just need to know that there is a hormone that is responsible for the bending of your plant in response to light. Okay, photoperiodism. Let's talk about this for a little bit. Photoperiodism is the reaction of organisms to the length of day or length of night. It ties in with something else that we call circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are kind of like your body's natural alarm system. It's your body's own little calendars, how it knows when it's time to sleep, when it's time to wake up, when it's time to produce certain hormones, that kind of thing. All living things respond to both circadian rhythms and photoperiodism. Photoperiodism is directly controlled by the length of day or length of night, and it happens in both plants and animals. In a way, you can almost think of it as responses to how much light we're exposed to and how much dark we're exposed to, if you will. So does this have to do with anything? Well, it's one of the ways that your plant's going to be able to figure out what direction light is coming from. It's also a way that plants can detect the intensity of light and the wavelength of light. And it's because these plants have light receptors that are called photochromes, or phytochromes, sorry. If you look at the pictures, you'll see that plants will grow differently and respond differently based on how long they're in the dark or how much red or infrared light they are exposed to. Okay, so this is important because it literally divides all plant life into two sections, what we call short day plants and long day plants. So short day plants or long night plants only flower when night or dark exceeds a critical period. So when we have mostly dark in a 24-hour stretch of time. If those plants are if that dark period, is interrupted at any time by light, then it's going to prevent those plants from flowering. So short day plants flower best when they're not exposed to long periods of light. They flower when they're exposed to long periods of dark, in other words. Okay? So if you look at the little picture, this rectangle is supposed to represent a 24-hour period. If we have light for too long, for more than 12 hours, the plant doesn't flower. Okay, that short day plant won't flower because technically this isn't a short day. If we have light for less than the 12-hour mark, the short day plant will flower. If we have light for less than the 12-hour period, but somehow that plant is exposed to light, so you take a picture of it, or you put the light on, or something like that, then the plant won't flower. This plant will only flower when it's only getting a small amount of light and a whole lot of dark, if that makes any kind of sense. So some plants fall into this category. Good examples would be poinsettias, which we see at Christmas time, and some types of bean plants and chrysanthemums. And how we see it in nature is that these particular kinds of plants, and all short day plants generally, will only flower in late summer, fall, or winter, because that's when the amount of daylight is greatly reduced. Now the opposite are long day plants. So long day plants actually need a longer period of actual light. They only flower if the night is shorter than a critical dark period. If light interrupts their long dark period, they will flower. So even if the day is short and the night is long, if you take pictures of them or you put the light on, they will still flower. Examples of plants that are long day plants are spinach, lettuce, irises, a lot of our cereals like wheat and barley and oat. All of those things are what we call long day plants. So again, if we look at our little diagram here, when there's a lot of light, this plant flowers. When there's not a lot of light, this plant does not flower. When there is a little bit of light, but some light is introduced during the dark period, this plant will still flower. Okay, another kind of tropism is called geotropism or gravitropism. And it is, the words got cut off, but it is the movement or growth in a plant in response to gravity. I'm going to write that in for you. So it's turning or movement. Let me write it up here. Whoops. Okay, so it is the turning or movement in response to gravity. So hence the term gravitropism or geotropism. A good example is when seeds are germinating, the roots always grow down. Well, they grow down because they're growing in the direction of geotropism, whereas the shoots grow up because they're growing in the direction of phototropism. Okay, one other main kind of tropism is called thigmotropism. And thigmotropism is movement or growth in response to touch. Okay, so some kind of touching stimulus. And a good example would be these plants like ivy, for example, which make little tendrils, or even peas. And when they come into contact with a fairly sturdy object, they will wind their tendrils around and use it to pull themselves up. More classically, we have plants like the Venus flytrap, which will move their leaves and trap insects inside of them in response to the insect brushing up against their little trigger hairs. Okay, now I want you to know that plants have a variety of hormones and that those hormones control a lot of metabolic functions. I don't want you to necessarily memorize which hormones do what. So pay more attention to the fact that these things happen, all of these things here, happen because of different types of hormones. So things like cell elongation and some types of tropisms are controlled by plant hormones called auxins. Cytokinins stimulate cytokinesis, or cell division, and cell differentiation. Gibberellins stimulate cell elongation and stems, so they help your plant to grow taller. Abscisic acid promotes what we call seed dormancy. So when conditions are not the best for a plant to be growing at that point in time, so like there's a lot of drought, or soil conditions aren't very good, or there's not a lot of nutrients in the soil, seeds will go through a dormant phase where they almost completely stop functioning metabolically. They just function the slightest amount to still be considered alive. So it's almost like the seed is sleeping. So this particular type of acid, which is a plant hormone, promotes that function. It slows down growth, and it promotes seed dormancy. Ethylene, which is actually a gas, promotes the ripening of fruit, and it also promotes cell death. So ethylene can be one of the reasons why your bananas turn brown and eventually they start spoiling, or even why leaves fall off of trees. Okay, germination. Germination depends on imbibition, not inhibition, but imbibition. Imbibition is the uptake of water due to low water potential of a dry seed. So when a seed is dormant, it's almost bone dry on the inside. Okay, if conditions become correct, meaning there's water in the soil, or if there's water in wherever that seed is located, then water is going to move into the seed, and that process is called imbibition. Okay, so it's the uptake of water due to low water potential within a dry seed. Once there's water on the inside, that seed is going to start awakening. So it's going to break the seed's dormant, and it's going to start to go through some of the metabolic processes necessary to produce a shoot system and a root system. The very first root, the embryonic root, called the radicle, is the first thing that's going to grow out of the seed, and it's going to come out and it's going to grow down. And then the pumule, which is the embryonic shoot, then breaks through the seed and comes up through the soil, and it's going to grow up. Right, so here are examples of both of those. This is in a dicot plant and a monocot plant. So good examples of monocots would be like beans, and good examples of dicots would be corn. So here we have our little radicle. See, it's growing down, and then eventually it'll start producing actual roots. And then Once the seed coat gets completely shed, we'll have a plumule system that's going to start growing up, and we're going to have a shoot and root system. Notice the one main taproot and then all these little tiny roots off of it, showing us that it is a dicot. And notice the two seed leaves showing us why it's called a dicotyledon. Actually, these are the seed leaves down here. These are more like real leaves. Now, on monocots, we have our radicle still growing down, and we have our plumule or coleoptile. Ooh, I can never say that word. Coleoptile. I call it a plumule because that's what I was always taught. But anyway, so it grows up. It's going to start producing your leaves. And notice we only have one leaf emerging, so hence the monocot term. And then eventually we'll have some more foliage leaves being made. Okay, so your ovary of your plant, not yours personally, but the ovary of your plant is what is going to develop into your fruit. And while we think that the fruit's all about how good it tastes and how pretty it looks, for the plant, it's all about protection. The fruit is there to protect the seeds that are on the inside. Never forget that for a plant, its seeds are its babies. Those are its little tiny babies. And it can't really take care of them the way that animals can. So it does everything possible for those seeds to survive. One of the things being making this fruit that surrounds those seeds. The fruit is also going to aid in seed dispersal, be it by wind or water or even animals. Fruits can be classified as dry if the ovary dries out when it's mature, or fleshy if the ovary becomes thick, soft, and sweet at maturity. So I try to think of a good example of a dry fruit. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but the fleshy ones, I have tons of examples. Mangoes, coconuts, plums, apples, pears. Any kind of fruit that you eat and you get from the supermarket would be an example of a fruit that becomes fleshy when it's mature. And of course, we are more attracted to the ones that smell good and are brightly colored and taste good. So more than likely, those are the ones that we will help in dispersing. All right, so here are some examples of different kinds of fruit. Yes, peas. Peas are seeds, so the actual pea that you eat is an actual seed, and the green pod around it is its fruit. This is what raspberry fruits look like. Notice that each little stamen is actually attached to its own little, what we call a fruitlet, and then all of those fruitlets come together. This is called an aggregated fruit. It just means that you have several little small fruit that all join together to make a big fruit. A pineapple is an example of what we call a multiple fruit. Each of those little diamond-shaped parts develops from its own very carpel, which means that each little one has its own little set of seeds within it. So that's why it's a multiple fruit, because each little diamond is a fruit. And then we have an accessory fruit, and apples are a good example of that. They grow from the very bottom part of the flower. The seed is completely in the center. It's really fleshy on the outside. And then the little fuzzy parts that we always pull off at the bottom part of the apple, that is the remnants of your stamen and your styles from when they were, the primary structures on your flower. Okay, fruit ripening. So the harder the fruit is, the better it does at protecting those seeds, obviously. So initially, while the seeds are still developing, fruits tend to be hard and tart. Tart just means that they're kind of sourish tasting. And that's going to protect your developing seed from things that want to eat them. No one wants to eat a hard piece of fruit, and no one wants to eat a sour piece of fruit. When those seeds are ready to disperse, those fruits are normally ripe by then. So they're ripe, they're sweet, and they're soft, so that the animals who do eat them will actually eat them and get to the seeds on the inside and then disperse those seeds, either mechanically by throwing them away or, through their poop as they move through the jungle or the desert or wherever. So initially, when fruits are not ripe, the cell walls in those cells are really, really tough, really, really strong. But as the seeds start developing more and more, it triggers what we call the ripening process. So the cell walls break down and they soften, and that makes the fruit softer. And then we get that sweet taste because the starch that used to be in the fruit gets converted into sugar over time, and it allows it to be sweet. That's one of the reasons I complain all the time about fruit in America, because you pick them off the trees so soon so that you can transport them to the grocery store that they don't have a chance for this step to happen, which is why so much of the fruit in the store doesn't actually taste as sweet as it should. Okay, apoptosis in plants. Now hopefully you remember that apoptosis is programmed cell death. And a lot of the events in plants actually involve apoptosis of some sort. It's normally in response to one of two hormones, either ethylene or auxin. And good examples would be when annual plants die every year after flowering. You know, those plants that only live for a year, so they flower, and once those seeds have been made and the pollen dispersed and all of that, the plant dies. All of that is through apoptosis. Then, more recently, you learned about xylem vessels, and I told you that xylem are pretty much dead on maturity, which allows them to be hollow on the inside. So the loss of that cytoplasm and the death of those organelles are all controlled by apoptosis. Another good example of apoptosis in plants would be during the autumn or the fall when leaves fall off the trees. They're breaking away from the branches or from their stems because of apoptosis, and this is what this picture here shows. Okay, I hope this was easy and not too painful. Let me know what your questions are, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.